was to talk a little bit first about the Rideau Institute, and I think that's relevant in terms of what organizations can do to respond to the kind of challenges that we heard from our first speaker. So I'll start out talking about, you know, what the Rideau Institute does and how we engage with Canadians. And then I will basically partly be answering that question about what do we expect the government to do. I would say we don't just expect the government to live up to Canadian values, we actually expect the Canadian government to live up to Canadian law. And I'm a lawyer and I'll have something to say about that. Canadian law and international law would also be very good. And so I'm going to touch on that. And that, of course, I'll talk a little bit about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our sort of embodiment of Canadian values, and also about the UN Charter, you know, the most important international embodiment of world values, rights, and obligations. And that will lead me into looking at where Canada is falling down so badly. Egypt is an example of a broader problem with respect to our engagement with regimes which have a number of serious human rights problems, many problems, but particularly human rights problems. And I'll look at that particularly from the point of view of our export control policy that's been in the media a lot, about particularly the huge $15 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, which has pushed Canada, catapulted Canada into the #2 arms seller to the Middle East, if you can believe that. If 10 years ago you had said to me that's what Canada's going to be, I would have laughed you out of the room. If you'd asked me to bet $1 million, I'd have bet against it. And I'd have lost my $1 million, sadly. That was, of course, under the old government, but as our previous speaker pointed out, sadly, we're not seeing as much of a change. We've seen a great change in tone, and we've had new symbols that have been very good. But in terms of actual substantive changes in some of these key areas, we haven't seen them. So I'll be looking at that from the point of view of what our export control policy, which is Canadian law, says, and what the government is actually doing, and how that might improve with a new international legal regime. And then I'll, well, at that stage I'll see where we're at. Might come back to the issue of networking with other organizations, but I'm actually going to, I might end with that. But okay, so back to the beginning, Rideau Institute. I'm the president of the Rideau Institute. I don't know if anybody is, if you've seen are people familiar with my background? Did you see the bio? You saw the bio, okay, so I won't go into that, okay. The Rideau Institute it's a pretty unique little organization. We're a tiny organization. Ali Hassan is one of our progressive public policy interns. He can sitting there, and they are very, very important. I think we have an impact greater than our tiny size. But the key thing about us is we're an independent, not-for-profit, non-charitable advocacy and research think tank. So the key thing is we do reports and so on. I'll talk a little bit about that. We do research, we do reports like other think tanks, which recommend changes to public policy. But we advocate for them. We don't just put out reports. We have campaigns. Because a key part of what we do, we have a website, rideauinstitute.ca, which is, looks like a regular think tank website. But we also have a social engagement website called Ceasefire CA. And we use that as a tool to engage Canadians. Our funding, our support, we don't take any money from government. Our support is entirely, mainly, very small donors from across Canada. So for those that say that Canadians don't care about foreign policy, well, we enough care about us that they keep our organization going. And as I said, the issues that we look at are foreign policy, defense policy, and some national security policy. And we look at it from the point of view of, in particular, strengthening the United Nations, trying to help the United Nations live, really live up to the UN Charter, so that it can be really a key mechanism for the peaceful resolution of disputes and for the prevention of conflict and for equality among states and security for all states. And all of these principles are in the UN Charter, but of course, and for strengthening international law, but you know, they're often honored in the breach. So that's a key area, that's a prism that we look through, that the Rideau Institute looks through. On our social engagement website, we'll have, so we'll put out reports, for example. We've done a report which we released during the election campaign on the terrible, terrible stain, essentially, on Canada, which has not been lifted yet, on the issue of Afghan detainees and the mountains of evidence that Canada knowingly transferred Afghans who were taken into Canadian custody in Kandahar, transferred them over to the Afghan authorities in essentially the certain knowledge that they would be tortured because the risk of torture was so high. That's an absolute breach of the Convention Against Torture. And when this government was in opposition, they spoke very loudly against the conservative government, the Harper government, which did everything possible, rather than dealing with the issue, putting in place proper procedures to make sure that it would not happen. Instead, they stonewalled, they shut down Parliament at one point to prevent a parliamentary committee from examining it. And the Foreign Minister Dion, then an opposition critic, he was very strongly, and other ministers very strongly called for a full accounting. Now they're in government, they are doing nothing to have, we've called for our report, which documents very, very clearly all of the efforts by the previous government to not get to the bottom of it. We call for a full-fledged public inquiry. I mean, how can we possibly hope to stand tall on the world stage? We say we're going to go for a position for the term 2021 on the UN Security Council if we are unwilling to deal with this issue. How did we go wrong? Why did we let this happen? And most important of all, how can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? So we did that report, we put it out, we had a press conference, but we also, on our social engagement side, of course, we posted the report, we did blogs about it, and we also had an online petition to the Prime Minister calling for, for him to support the public inquiry. To date, the Prime Minister has not responded. The Minister of Defense has responded. Of course, this is an issue that involves foreign affairs. Foreign affairs was the lead with respect to Afghanistan, so the policy was developed involving foreign affairs, national defense, Privy Council office, Corrections Canada was also involved, so there's a whole range of ministries that were involved in this policy, which was allowing Afghan detainees, many of whom were just poor innocent farmers, wrong place, wrong time, to be sent off sent off to torture. So as I said, all of these departments are implicated, and Department of Defense is just one of them, and that's why we made our appeal to the Prime Minister of Canada. The worst possible person to have responding, if you want to respond in good faith, is the Minister of Defense. First of all, he can't speak for the whole rest of the government, but why do you think it would be? Why do you think? Why would I say? Minister of Defense, Harjit Sajjan. The first hint is, what was he before he was the Minister of Defense? While he was a police officer in British Columbia, what was he before that? What was our Defense Minister during the time that Canada was in Kandahar? During the time that these events took place, which are extremely well documented, about the widespread, systematic torture of detainees. He was the intelligence officer for the Canadian military, the army, in Kandahar, the senior intelligence officer. Now, Maybe he didn't know what was going on, in which case I guess he wasn't a very good intelligence officer. But in any event, he is not the person that you put forward to say to the Canadian public, we've examined this thoroughly and there's nothing here, everybody acted properly and we don't need to have an inquiry. In fact, it's insulting to everyone who is following this issue that they would put the very minister who would be a witness in the inquiry to say this. So this is the kind of thing that is discouraging when you're looking for substance behind the new tone of the government. So we're still waiting. We're waiting to hear from the Prime Minister. In fact, we're encouraged by the fact that at least he's kept silent, because that means maybe if we keep up the pressure, and we intend to, and more information is coming out, because the Military Police Complaints Commission, in fact, has received new information, so they are actually actively investigating now. So we hope, and we have a group working with a number of organizations, and we are working to try and go to the next step. By the way, the International Criminal Court is also investigating. Of course, the International Criminal Court likes to, they can't do everything. So they look at the primary actors first. So their first priority is to examine the Afghan side of this. But they're also examining American military forces. They have led that, they have specifically stated that. And in all likelihood, they're investigating Canadian forces as well. It's just that they haven't got to the stage where they're saying that publicly yet. So that's the kind of report we get into, and one example of a report, but also to show you how we put out the report, but then we work very actively to try and make the report known and to try and get Canadians to speak out. We will likely have more social engagement on this issue as we go forward. Another one of the reports, I mentioned this because I saw in one of the slides there was reference to, and this was a terrible thing under the previous government, and this is an area where I can be positive. The new government is acting. They have taken some steps. There's a lot more to do, but they've taken some steps. And that's in the area of treatment of Canadians abroad. Consular assistance. So when Canadians get into trouble abroad, how does the government treat them? Now, in the past, it's equality of Canadians. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. So if you get into trouble abroad, your government provides the assistance that it can provide. Under the Harper government, a very, very different course of action. They started making judgments about Canadians. And some Canadians were worthy and other Canadians weren't worthy. And they introduced, in fact, discrimination in the treatment. And the biggest example, the clearest example, was in cases of dual citizenship. For certain, they introduced a new law where for certain offenses, after those Canadians had served their sentence here, the offenses were so-called terrorist offenses. Then after this Canadian citizen had served their sentence here, they would be deported to their other country in the case of being dual citizens. Now, many Canadians don't realize that many dual citizens have, it's not just because they want to be citizens of the country of birth and the country they've chosen, Canada, it's also because in many, many cases you can't renounce your first citizenship. Many, many countries in the world do not allow you to give up your citizenship. So you're a dual citizen whether you like it or not. And therefore, the fact that because there's this underlying assumption, if they're real Canadians, they'll only have Canadian citizenship, simply. I mean, that's offensive to multiculturalism, but it's also a practical problem for all of the Canadians who can't, who can't give up their citizenship of birth. Partly this has to do with countries wanting to know, part of this is a suspicion on the part of certain countries. They want to know when one of their citizens comes into the country. So for example, China. Now, China's not a problem on this issue because we've actually negotiated a bilateral agreement. But China, if you are a dual citizen, and you can't give up your Chinese citizenship, if you're a Chinese, a Canadian, it's also a Chinese citizen, you have to travel on your Chinese passport when you go to China. Because they want to know, you see, they don't want to know. They don't want you coming into the country on a Canadian they don't know. I mean, that's the attitude of some countries. And Syria was an example. That mattered very much. That matters very much when you get into trouble. Syria and others. A range of countries require this. The problem that arises is that, well, let me backtrack one step. The Canadian government has changed the law so that there's no longer discrimination against dual citizens who are convicted of certain offenses. In other words, all Canadians, if they're convicted of any offense, they serve their sentence and then they come out into Canadian society again. So they've taken away this discrimination against dual citizens. So then the government acted very quickly on that. But there's a more difficult problem with dual citizenship, and that's this one where if you're a dual citizen of many countries, you have to use the passport of that other country when you enter that country. Under the the Vienna Convention, which has all the rules for how a country offers consular services to their citizens when they're in trouble abroad, those rules say that if you enter the country, say you're Chinese and you enter the country on a Chinese passport, then Canada cannot offer consular assistance. You're treated as a Chinese citizen because you entered on a Chinese passport. Now, as I said, we've reached a bilateral agreement with China, so they will allow us to offer consular assistance, or at least that's the theory. So this is a big issue. There are 5 million, at any given time, there are 5 million Canadians outside Canada. We don't even know how many are dual citizens. If you get into trouble in another country, or your child, your son or daughter, heaven forbid, is out in a country and gets into trouble, you really want to make sure that they can get help from the Canadian government if they need it. So this is an issue that's going to take negotiation, it's going to take work among countries, it's going to take more agreements to solve. But I got into this because that's another report that we did. We did a report, a former head of consular affairs as an advisor to the Rideau Institute. He did a report for us on helping Canadians abroad, a legislative and policy agenda. There's a whole range of different problems that I've just mentioned too that need addressing. And if you think about, we do a lot of reports on foreign policy, defense policy, all these different things. This report on helping Canadians abroad probably will have more impact if those issues are addressed by the government than many other reports, because as I said, 5 million Canadians outside the country at any given time. And in those slides that we saw earlier, of course, we saw the problem with, we saw the selectivity of the Canadian government when it came to responding to Mohammed Fahmy, for example. More interest, it seemed, in keeping a good relationship with the government than in providing proper consular relations services for Canadian citizens. So one of the things our report is really trying to push for, and it's interesting, some countries have this, the United States has it, we don't, is essentially setting out what the rights are, essentially codifying that Canadians have this right to consular assistance. Because right now it's known as a Crown prerogative, which it's not good when it's a Crown prerogative, because the Crown can do whatever it likes, in history. So we would like to get that codified. So that's another one of the things that we've done. Okay, I've got to get going here further. We've done, my background, if you saw on that, on the CV, aside from being Ambassador for Disarmament to the UN, and then the other big area that I've worked in is UN peacekeeping related stuff. And so I was very happy that we were able to put out a report on peacekeeping training. Because, and it frustrates me no end, the kinds of comments in the press, and we have, we have the Minister of Defense. I mean, today, he's quoted in the press. I mean, he's in Africa because Canada said they're going to re-engage in peacekeeping. So he's there doing a fact-finding thing. And I mean, I'm glad he's doing a fact-finding because what he says to the media shows that he really needs to learn more about peacekeeping. So he says things like, the peacekeeping, well, it really doesn't seem to be peacekeeping. It seems to be there's a lot of conflict going on here. I mean, in the 15 years that Canada has been involved in peacekeeping, peacekeeping has changed. It's become much more challenging. The environments are much more challenging. And it's still, the fundamental basis of peacekeeping is still that the military is there to support a broader peace process. And when it doesn't work, it's because the peace process is not working. And when the military is not there to wage a war, it's there to support the peacekeeping process. And we used to, of course, have, and I was a faculty member for many years, an international peacekeeping training center. And the point there was to get the military to train, not only with other militaries, it was an international training center, but to get them to train with all of the civilians who are critical to the success of the peacekeeping mission. A UN peacekeeping mission is headed by a civilian, unlike the NATO missions, which are headed by the military and are strictly a military operation. So, if we're going to re-engage in peacekeeping, and this is what our report said, the first thing we've got to do is actually do some training, and the first guy that needs some training, frankly, is the Minister of Defense. We need to reinstitute an international peacekeeping training center, because the military needs, you know, you can put it in very clear military terms. You, military, in a peacekeeping operation, are not the center of gravity. The center of gravity is the peace process. You are there as a support. I'm using military terminology there. They get it. They understand it when you put it that way. You're not the center. You're a supporting actor. Everything that you're doing, you have to say, is it going to help the peace process? Is it going to help stabilize the situation? So, there's a lot Canada can do on peacekeeping, but only when we get our own act together and have really reinstitute really good training. We were the first one to have an international. Canada, in 1995, opened the first international peacekeeping training center, which had this concept of the peacekeeping partnership with the civilians, the police, human rights, governance, military training together. And then, of course, the previous government shut it down after they, lost all interest in peacekeeping. And many other countries now have such a center, and let's hope that we get it set up again. Because, Afghanistan is an example of how not to do it. You're not going to bring peace to a country by waging a war. From the very beginning, there had to be a broad-based peace negotiation. Whatever one may think of the Taliban, they represent a huge segment of the country, and they have to be negotiated with, and they have to be included. And then you try and find the best possible way to do that. And that wasn't done, and we're now where are we? Well, right now, there's battles going on where they're taking over even more of Afghanistan. So 14 years, how many people died? Civilians in Afghanistan, Canadian soldiers wounded and civilians wounded and killed. And it was because it was a military-centric operation. NATO, thinking that they could bring peace by waging war. And so I'm very passionate on UN peacekeeping because they've got the military in the right way. They are a supporting element. And it focuses all your attention on the peace process, which of course is not easy. These kinds of negotiations, of course they're not easy. If they were easy, everybody would do them. But there's no substitute. There is no substitute for them. So, that's the kind of thing we do, and we have our reports, we have our petitions, we have our all of these social engagement mechanisms, and that brings me around now, of course, to, and I've talked about these fundamental values. I mentioned the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which embodies, the key things that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms encodes is the absolute importance of equality, no discrimination, and also due process, rule of law. The fact that you cannot be arbitrarily, without a fair legal process, deprived of your freedom. And that's sort of the fundamental basis of the Canadian, the Canadian system, embodied in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's also really fundamentally underlying the UN Charter. The UN Charter, which is binding on all member states, goes further, of course. It also encapsulates the peaceful resolution of disputes and the non-use of force, the non-threat or use of force, unless authorized by the UN Security Council in a very specific way. So these are principles that we see that we honored, sadly, more in the breach than in the than in the fulfillment of. And Canada did wander away from the absolute importance of any military action that we take part in being clearly legal under international law, and I'm hoping very much that that's something that we can, that the new government is going to be much more wary of. Okay, so we've got these broad principles guiding Canada, but we also have more specific requirements that are very relevant in the case, in what I want to talk about now with respect to Egypt, but not just with respect to Egypt, and that is Canada's very, very disturbing, I mentioned it off the top, change over time with respect to military exports. We have very, very, very good principles, but the application of them has gotten steadily worse. And as I said off the top, where we ended up being, we now are #2 arms seller to the Middle East. And overall, I'm trying to find the principles here. Overall, Canada's the international body that's considered one of the most authoritative that's publicly available to everyone is SIPRI. So the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, and they do the annual military balance. And they usually have Canada 15th in terms of world ranking in terms of military exports. And that by, I think it's very fair to say that that really understates what we're doing, because I've mentioned to you that we're number 2 in the Middle East, but who, and of course #1 is United States. But who do you think is the country that our biggest destination for military exports, military equipment? Saudi Arabia is #2. Well, was #2. Yes, it's still #2. It was #1. It's never been higher than #2. So who's #1?
Is it Israel?
No. United States. United States. You see, you don't even know about it because the numbers are not reported. We've had a defense production sharing agreement with the United States since the 50s. And so exports, the way that we find out about military exports is that the government reports on export permits, because they control goods by requiring licenses or permits. And then they keep track of them, and then they do, well, the Harper government hardly did any, but I'm happy to say that the Liberal government is reinstituting the proper reporting. But exempted from that reporting system, exempted from the permit system, is all of our military exports to the United States. Those exports are parts, components. Canadian industry is essentially part of the bigger American military industry, and they produce components or parts or subsystems most of the time. Not all the time, because the big exception are the armored vehicles, the labs, the light armored vehicles. I mean, if you see them and they were coming at you, you wouldn't think they were that light. They're tracked vehicles, they look like tanks, they have huge, weaponry on them. Those we export to the US so as a complete system. We also have some other things like unmanned aerial vehicles or a few other things. But mainly we're exporting subsystems for bigger American systems. So if you included that, we would be much higher up on the list. But we don't even know the extent of that because it's not reported. Good news, Canada says it's going to ratify the Arms Trade Treaty. They've even given a date, Foreign Minister Dion, and I hope this was a smart person on his staff that told him to do this, because then he can hold the department's feet to the fire on this. June 2017. He wants to be through the ratification process. Legislation has to be tabled in Canada, meeting all the requirements of the Arms Trade Treaty. And under that treaty, everything has to be reported. So all the exports to the United States will have to be reported as well. So unfortunately, that's going to push us up the list of arms exporters. But so we can look forward. We can hope that there might be some improvement in transparency anyway. But going back to this great policy that we've had, and the policy actually for control of military exports to include human rights goes back to 1986. I actually, all those years ago, I was in the Foreign Minister's office actually worked on these guidelines, on the 1986 guidelines on military exports. And let me tell you, I can say it now, it's past the 20-year rule. We had a knock them down, drag them out battle with the trade guys in the department.
because they didn't want us to put in human rights criteria. They were completely against it. And in fact, the minister's office had to take an active part in the drafting of the documentation. I was an international security policy advisor in the minister's office, in order to get a fair description of the human rights criteria, because they wouldn't even put it in the document. Anyway, we did get it in. So, the policy that we have, I mean, it sounds good. It sounds good. The policy is, first of all, there's broad objectives for our export controls. Do not cause harm to Canada and its allies. Do not undermine national or international security. Now that's a huge one. You know, don't provide weapons to conflict zones. Do not contribute to national or regional conflicts or instability. I mean, these are general objectives. Make sure they're not used to commit human rights violations. Are consistent with sanctions, and that's very important in terms of, say, UN sanctions. I don't know if anybody of you, if you've been following a hideous story in the media that's come out several times, 3 different stories at least, on this company called Light, L-E-I-T-T. It's a manufacturer of armored vehicles, not like the labs, armored vehicles that are more like, I don't know, they're more like, sort of like Humvees, but they're weaponized as well. And this Canadian company has been accused by the UN Sanctions Committee on South Sudan, named, a Canadian company named in a UN naming and shaming report as having exported those vehicles to South Sudan in breach of the UN arms embargo on South Sudan. To the military end user, not like to a civilian end user, but to a military end user. And the Canadian government's first response was, Global Affairs was, oh, this has nothing to do with us because they were it's a Canadian company, but they were manufactured in the United Arab Emirates. And that, of course, is one of the oldest tricks in the book. You set up in all these places that don't have tough rules, and then you say, well, it's not us, what can we do? It so happens that Canadian law, and this was done precisely for this reason, this was done back. This was done under, when Lloyd Axworthy was foreign minister. The UN said, we have to deal with breaches of UN sanctions, the arms embargoes. You have to put into your law provisions that allow you to go after your citizens wherever they are doing this. So Canadian United Nations Act for the enforcement of UN arms embargoes provides that if Canadians do this anywhere in the world, they can and should be prosecuted in Canada. So, Foreign Affairs, we are encouraging letter writing to Foreign Affairs on this because, yes, it does. They can't say, oh, it took place, in some other country. If it's a Canadian company, it's our business. So again, I'm showing the difference between the principles, the good language, the law, and what we're actually doing. So those were the general principles. But here's the guidelines that we put in place in 1986, or that I contributed to putting in place. It was the government of Canada that put them in place. With respect to military goods and technology, Canadian export control policy has for many years been restrictive. So this is giving you the idea where they're coming from. This is serious business, but it's not just ordinary trade. Under present policy guidelines set out by Cabinet in 1986, Canada closely controls the export of military equipment to countries which pose a threat to Canada and its allies, countries involved in or under imminent threat of hostilities, countries under United Nations sanctions, or countries whose governments have a persistent record of serious violations of the human rights of their citizens, unless it can be demonstrated that there is no reasonable risk that the goods might be used against the civilian population. So, there's, I don't know, water bottles made of really soft material. Maybe you could ship them to the military and that would be okay, but it's pretty clear what you're not supposed to do. So that's the policy which somehow allowed the Harper government to sell $15 billion worth of armored vehicles, which are kitted out with extremely, massive firepower, to what has been you know, to Saudi Arabia, who has been, I mean, the cataloging of the human rights violations. I mean, it's routinely categorized as the worst of the worst human rights offenders. And this was all before the latest business in Yemen. So the Harper government approves this deal, allows this deal to go forward. But it's only when the new government comes in that we find out that the export permits are approved, because it was for a new series of labs. It was for a new generation of labs. And so they were under development. So when the deal was made, they weren't actually built yet. They had to develop them and build them. So the export permits that were granted by the Harper government were related to the technology involved and did not relate to the actual transfer of the equipment. So in other words, when the Liberal government came in, nothing had been shipped. And we don't even think anything's been shipped yet. Nothing had been built when they came in, and nothing had been shipped. And the other big thing that had happened, I mean, the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia was very, very bad when the Harper government approved and should never have approved this deal, not least because of the role of Saudi Arabia with respect to repressing the Bahrain Arab Spring using labs, but also there's mounting evidence that the labs are being used in internal to put down as practically a police occupation, military occupation of those areas of Saudi Arabia where the Shia population is concentrated. So lots of evidence of use under the Harper government. But what has happened, so no excuses there. But then the Liberal government comes in. They say, oh, there's jobs, there's a lot of jobs, there's 3,000 or 4,000 jobs in London, Ontario that rely on this. Frankly, I find it unbelievably offensive that Canadian workers are told that their jobs depend on the abuse, the extreme repression of human beings abroad. I mean, that cannot be the basis on which the government has a responsibility to ensure that there are good jobs, that the skills and the talents are put to good use.